private conversation that only opens up when two people have built up enough trust that neither one is performing anymore. That's when the real talk can begin. What comes out in those conversations, almost without exception, is the near miss. The thing that almost ended it. The moment where one decision going differently, one relationship going a different direction, one piece of timing being slightly off would have changed everything. The outcome we're sitting there looking back on simply wouldn't have happened. Not in some hypothetical sense, in the actual sense. The version of events that almost was. That was within one or two small adjustments of being the version that became real. These near misses aren't part of the public version. The public version is shaped by certain demands. It needs to fit into a talk. It needs to inspire an audience. It needs to be coherent enough that someone can hear it and walk away with a takeaway. Those demands push the story toward a particular shape, a clean arc, a recognizable journey, a series of decisions that make sense in retrospect, even if they didn't make sense at the time. The mess gets edited out because the mess doesn't fit the form. The near misses get compressed because dwelling on them would slow the story down. The version that arrives in the audience's ears is technically true, but materially incomplete. What's genuinely interesting is what happens when the demands of the public version get removed, when the conversation is private, when there's no audience to manage, when the person telling the story isn't also constructing it for public consumption. They tell it differently, and they'll say things like, this whole thing was within an inch of not happening. They'll describe the specific moment, the specific decision, the specific person who happened to take their call when no one else would have. They'll name the timing element that was completely outside their control, the thing that, if it had gone the other way, would have ended everything. They aren't being modest. They aren't performing humility. They're just telling the story the way it actually was. This matters beyond being interesting in itself because of what it reveals about how the building of significant things actually works. The cleaned-up public story implies that the success was the product of a series of correct decisions, made by a person who knew what they were doing, executing a plan that essentially worked. The private version reveals something different. The success was the product of a person who kept showing up across a long stretch of time, navigating real uncertainty, making decisions with incomplete information, and being lucky enough at certain key moments that the variables they didn't control resolved in their favor. That's a different story. And it produces different conclusions about how to approach the project of building something with your own life. If you only absorb the public version, you walk away believing that the successful people you admire had a clarity and a control that you don't have. You walk away believing that the difference between them and you is something they had access to that you don't. The private version makes a different point. It says they were sitting inside the same uncertainty you're sitting inside. They were navigating the same not knowing. They were dependent on the same kinds of variables that were outside their control. The difference wasn't certainty. The difference was that they kept going through the uncertainty long enough that at some point, the variables resolved in their favor, and the meeting happened, the meeting that the long preparation had been building toward. The cleaned-up version of the story serves a real purpose. It gives the audience something portable, something they can carry away and use, something that fits into the limited space available in any single conversation about how a successful life got built. There's nothing wrong with that exactly. But the price of fitting the story into that space is that certain things have to be removed. And the things that get removed are often the things that would have been most useful to the audience if they had been left in. The arc gets imposed retroactively. In the lived version, there was no arc. There was a sequence of days, each one with its own challenges and its own small decisions. None of them obviously connected to a destination because the destination wasn't visible. The arc is something that gets built afterward, when the destination is known and the path leading to it can be traced back through the days. From the inside, while it was being lived, it wasn't an arc. It was a series of present moments, each one carrying the full weight of its own uncertainty. with no guarantee that any of it was leading anywhere. The same is true of the destination. The cleaned-up version implies the destination was somewhere the person was moving toward intentionally, that they had it in mind, that they were optimizing for it, that the daily decisions were being made with reference to the eventual outcome. This is rarely how it actually was. The eventual outcome was usually a surprise. The destination was something that emerged from the path, not something the path was designed to reach. The person was working on what was in front of them, doing what seemed worth doing in the moment. And the destination was what showed up at the end of all of that, partly because of what they had been doing, partly because of conditions they hadn't predicted and couldn't have planned for. The logical journey gets imposed for the same reason the arc gets imposed. In the cleaned-up version, the decisions made along the way looked like they were made with information that wasn't actually available at the time. The person seems to have known things they couldn't have known, anticipated things that hadn't happened yet, made connections between events that hadn't occurred at the time the decision was being made. From the inside, the decisions were being made with the information that was available, which was always partial, often misleading, and never enough to know whether the decision was going to look smart in retrospect. What gets lost in all this editing is the texture of actually being inside it, the texture of not knowing if it's going to work, the texture of making a decision with the best information you have, and then finding out, sometimes much later, whether the decision was a good one. The texture of long stretches where nothing visible is happening, and you can't tell whether you're building something or wasting your time. And that texture is what the people who are trying to build their own lives most need to understand, because that texture is what they're going to be sitting inside themselves, and the cleaned-up version hasn't prepared them for it. If you've only heard the public versions of how successful lives get built, you may have absorbed an unrealistic standard for what your own experience should feel like while it's happening. You may have absorbed the idea that if you're doing it right, you should feel a kind of clarity and forward motion that the actual experience of building something doesn't produce. And when your own experience doesn't match that imagined standard, when you find yourself inside long periods of uncertainty, making decisions with incomplete information, unable to tell whether what you're doing is going to amount to anything, you may conclude you must be doing it wrong. You may conclude that the people who succeeded must not have felt this way, and that your feeling this way is a sign you don't have what they had. That conclusion isn't accurate. The people who succeeded felt exactly this way. The uncertainty was the same. The not knowing was the same. The texture of the daily experience while it was happening was, to a meaningful degree, the same as what you're inside right now. The difference isn't that they were operating with a clarity you don't have access to. The difference is in what they did inside the uncertainty, not in any privileged position above it. The near misses, when you finally hear them described honestly, come in a few recognizable shapes. And it's worth knowing what they look like. Because if you're building anything serious, you're probably already inside one or more of them right now. And recognizing the shape can change how you handle it. The financial near miss is the most common, especially when you're building something new. There's a moment where the runway is almost gone. The money is about to run out. The next move was supposed to fund the continuation, and the next move hasn't happened on the timeline the runway required. The person is doing the math each week, and each week the math is getting worse. They're looking at how many weeks they can sustain it before the whole thing has to end. Then, often at the last possible moment, something comes through. A check arrives, a deal closes, a relationship pays off in a way that wasn't fully predictable. The building continues. And a year later, the thing that was almost over is being described in a press release as an overnight success. The relational near miss is the one that depends on a specific person doing a specific thing at a specific moment. An introduction that nearly didn't happen. A mentor who almost didn't take the call. A potential partner who almost said no. The whole project hinges, in retrospect, on this one person responding the way they responded. and the response could easily have gone the other way. The person was busy. The timing was bad. There was no obligation. They could have just not bothered. And most people in their position wouldn't have bothered. And the entire trajectory of the thing would have ended right there. They did bother, for reasons of their own that often had nothing to do with the project itself. And the trajectory continued because of that one moment of unasked for generosity. The timing near miss is the one that's hardest to think about clearly, because it makes you feel small. The conditions in the world happened to line up with what was being built at exactly the moment when the alignment could matter. A year earlier, the thing being built would have been too early. The market wouldn't have been ready. The infrastructure wouldn't have been in place. A year later, it would have been too late. Someone else would have built the same thing, or the moment for that kind of thing would have passed. The window was narrow. The window happened to open at the right time. The person was there and ready when it opened. They walked through it. And now the cleaned up story makes it sound like they invented the moment, when the truth is, the moment invented them as much as the other way around. What all these near misses have in common is that they weren't planned. The person didn't engineer them. They didn't know while they were inside the moment that this was the moment. They experienced the moment as one more uncertain development in a long series of uncertain developments, with no special label on it that said, this is the one that's going to determine whether everything works. The moment looked, in real time, exactly like the other moments looked. It was only afterward, when the outcome had resolved and the trajectory was visible, that the moment got identified as the near miss. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it has a specific implication for how you handle the present. If the people who succeeded were navigating real uncertainty, and if the moments that turned out to matter most weren't labeled as such while they were happening, then there's no way for you to know which of the moments you're currently inside is the one that's going to look, in 5 or 10 years of hindsight, like the moment everything turned. You can't know which conversation is the one that leads somewhere important. You can't know which decision is the one that sets the trajectory. You can't know which relationship is the one that changes the shape of what gets built. The near misses don't come with labels on them. They come looking exactly like the ordinary days that surround them. By the time you can identify them as near misses, the moment has already passed, and the outcome has already been determined by what you did inside the moment, while you didn't yet know what kind of moment it was. The fact that you can't tell which moment is the important one has a strategic implication most people miss. Because they can't tell, they tend to wait until the moment seems important before they bring their full effort to it. This is a reasonable sounding strategy that produces consistently bad results, because the moments that turn out to be the most important don't announce themselves as important while they're happening. They look ordinary. They look like the dozens of other ordinary moments that surround them. The person who calibrates their effort to how important the moment seems will reliably bring less than full effort to the moment that turns out to matter most. Because that moment wasn't flagging itself as the moment. If you can't identify the important moment in advance, the only available strategy is to treat all moments as if they could be the important one. Not in some frantic, anxious way that exhausts you across thousands of ordinary days. More like the way of a person who understands that the high-leverage moments are mixed in with the ordinary ones. That the high-leverage moments don't look different on the surface. And that the only way to be ready when one of them turns out to matter is to be operating at a level of consistent care that doesn't drop just because the day looks unremarkable. This is what the people who succeed across long timelines actually do, even if they don't describe it this way. They handle the unremarkable conversation with the same attention they'd bring to a high-stakes one. They write the email that doesn't seem to matter with the same care as the email they know is being read by someone important. They show up for the meeting nobody's paying attention to with the same engagement as the meeting where everyone is watching, Not because they've predicted that any specific one of these is going to turn out to be the near-miss moment, because they understand that any one of them could be. And the only way to be ready for the one that is to be ready for all of them. This sounds exhausting in the abstract, but it's actually less exhausting in practice than the alternative. The alternative, calibrating your effort to how important the moment seems, requires a constant evaluation of every single interaction to figure out how much effort to bring. And that evaluation itself burns energy. The decision about whether this moment deserves your full effort or only some of it is a daily judgment call that adds up. The person who's decided to bring the same level of care to all their interactions, regardless of how important they seem, has settled that question once and freed up the energy that would otherwise be spent on the daily evaluation. And I'm telling you, there's a quality issue that emerges over time. The person who calibrates their effort to apparent importance develops the habit of calibrating, and the habit shows up even when they don't intend it. They become someone who can perform when the stakes are visibly high, but who delivers less than their best when the stakes aren't obvious. And people notice this. The pattern becomes part of who that person is professionally, and it shapes how they get treated, what they get offered, what they get included in. The person who treats the unremarkable moment with full care also develops a habit, and that habit shows up in the same way, as a defining feature of who they are professionally, visible to everyone who works with them, shaping how they get treated and what doors open over time. The compounding here is significant. Over the span of a career, the difference between someone who brings full care to all their interactions and someone who calibrates to apparent importance is not a small difference. It shows up in reputation. It shows up in opportunities. It shows up in the specific people who decide to invest their time in helping that person, because they've noticed the pattern of how that person operates and concluded that the time will be well spent. None of this is visible in any single moment. It accumulates across years of moments, in a pattern that becomes recognizable to the people who are paying attention. So if you accept that the near misses are invisible while they're happening, and that the only available strategy is to handle all moments with full care, then the question of how to build a career stops being about identifying and seizing key moments. It becomes about establishing the practice of full care across all moments, trusting that the right moments will emerge from that practice over time, in ways you can't predict in advance, and don't need to predict in advance for the practice to work. There's a less talked about but very real benefit to the near miss, and it has to do with what going through one actually develops in the person who goes through it. Not the near miss as a story, the near miss as a lived event, being close to the success, watching it almost happen, watching it not happen the way you hoped, and continuing to build anyway. Something gets built in a person who has gone through that. Something that doesn't get built in a person who has been protected from it. What gets built is judgment, specifically the kind of judgment that comes from having been close enough to the thing to understand what it actually requires. Most people have a theoretical understanding of what success in their field requires. They've read about it, heard others describe it, formed mental models of what the journey to it looks like. Those models are based on incomplete information, because the public versions of success don't contain the texture of what the actual building feels like from the inside. The person who's been through a near miss has been close enough to fill in some of that texture for themselves. They know things now that they didn't know before, and that they couldn't have learned any other way. They know what the energy required for the final stretch actually feels like. They know which kinds of effort matter most in the moments that matter most. They know which of their habits hold up under pressure and which ones fall apart. They know what their actual response is to the sustained uncertainty of being close to something significant without knowing yet whether it's going to resolve. None of this knowledge is theoretical. It's direct, hard-won, and it's the most useful kind of knowledge there is for the project of trying again, because it reveals exactly where the gap was between where they were and where they needed to be. This is why the people who eventually succeed at hard things are almost always people who failed at them first. Not failed completely, not abandoned the direction, but come close enough to the success to see what it required and fallen short in ways that revealed exactly where the shortfall was. The shortfall is the most useful information there is. It's the gap, named precisely between current capability and required capability. Once the gap is named precisely, it can be closed precisely. The next attempt isn't based on theoretical preparation. It's based on an actual diagnosis of what was missing the last time. The person who has never been close to the thing doesn't have this information. They're operating on theory. They've been imagining what the requirements are, and their imagination is necessarily incomplete because they haven't yet had the experience that would correct the imagination. When they finally make their first close attempt, the gap between their preparation and the actual requirements will be fully visible to them in a way it wasn't before. And that visibility is what lets the next attempt be calibrated correctly. This recasts the near miss from a setback into a phase of development. The first real attempt isn't the test of whether you can do the thing. It's the test of whether you've understood what the thing actually requires. If the attempt fails because of a gap you can now name precisely, the failure has produced something valuable, a precise diagnosis that the next attempt can address. If the attempt fails for reasons you still can't articulate, then the diagnosis is incomplete and more attempts are needed. Either way, the attempts aren't failures in the sense of waste. They're the only available mechanism for getting accurate information about what success in your specific situation actually requires. The people who treat their near misses this way, as diagnostic information rather than as verdicts on their worth, make rapid progress between attempts. They use the near miss to update their understanding of what the gap is, and they direct their preparation accordingly. The people who treat the near miss as a verdict tend to either give up entirely or repeat the same approach with more force, neither of which addresses the actual gap the near miss revealed. The first response wastes the information by leaving the field. The second wastes it by failing to use it. This is why the people who succeed across multiple cycles tend to have a long history of near misses behind them. Not as evidence that they're flawed, as evidence of the development process working. They got close, learned what was missing, closed the gap, got close again, learned what was still missing, closed that gap, and so on. The pattern isn't flat progress. It's a series of approaches that get more accurate with each attempt, until eventually the approach is accurate enough that the moment of meeting between preparation and conditions actually produces the result. Most people relate to uncertainty the way they relate to a problem that needs to be solved. They treat the absence of resolution as an unacceptable condition, something that's wrong, something that needs to be made to stop, something that's somehow evidence of a failure in the situation or in themselves. And from inside that relationship with uncertainty, every day the question stays open is a day of low-grade suffering, a day of pushing against something that won't move, a day of wondering whether what you're doing is going to amount to anything, whether the time you're spending is well spent or wasted in ways you'll only fully understand in retrospect when it's too late to redirect. That relationship with uncertainty is exhausting in a way that compounds. It produces a daily emotional tax that gets paid on top of the actual work. And across the long stretches that any serious building requires, the tax adds up to a meaningful drain on the energy available for the work itself. It also produces specific distortions in the decisions you make. When uncertainty feels like an unacceptable condition that needs to end, you make decisions designed to end the uncertainty, rather than decisions designed to move toward the actual outcome you want. You chase the thing that would give you clarity instead of the thing that would actually serve the goal. And those decisions, made under the pressure of treating uncertainty like a problem, are frequently the ones that undermine the long process, rather than advance it. The people who get through the long, uncertain middle of building something significant have a different relationship with uncertainty. It's not that they enjoy it, exactly. It would be dishonest to suggest that uncertainty is comfortable for them the way certainty would be comfortable. But they're not at war with it the way most people are. They've arrived through experience or through a clarity of understanding that some people get to without the experience. At the recognition that the uncertainty isn't a sign that something has gone wrong. It's the honest condition of building something whose outcome isn't yet determined. The outcome isn't yet determined because the process isn't yet complete. And the process not being complete yet isn't a failure. It's just where you are in the building. From inside that relationship with uncertainty, the day-to-day experience of building is meaningfully different, not free of difficulty. There's no free of difficulty version of building anything significant. But the difficulty is the difficulty of the work itself, not the additional difficulty of fighting against the fact that the work hasn't yet produced certainty. The energy that most people spend resisting the uncertainty gets freed up to go into the building. And that energy, redirected toward the actual work, rather than toward the emotional management of not knowing, is what sustains the quality of effort over the long stretches the building requires. The shift from one relationship with uncertainty to the other doesn't happen quickly. And it doesn't happen by telling yourself the right thing. It happens through accumulated experience of having sat inside uncertainty and survived it. Each time you've lived through a stretch of not knowing how something was going to resolve, and the stretch has eventually resolved, and the not knowing turned out to be tolerable rather than catastrophic, you build evidence. Evidence that the not knowing is something you can be inside without it destroying you. That evidence accumulates over time. And gradually, the relationship shifts from one of war to one of acceptance. The people who've done this work, who've been through enough cycles of uncertainty, followed by resolution, that they've stopped treating the uncertainty as an emergency, operate with a noticeable advantage in the long building. They aren't burning energy on the wrong battle. They aren't making distorted decisions in the service of resolving the uncertainty prematurely. They're doing the actual work with the actual attention it deserves, while the uncertainty resolves itself in its own time. The harder question is what to do if you haven't yet done that work. If you're currently operating from the older relationship with uncertainty, where not knowing feels intolerable, the answer isn't satisfying in the abstract, but it's true in reality. You stay. You sit inside the uncertainty long enough that you start to develop your own evidence that you can survive it. You don't try to resolve it through aggressive action that would only undermine the process. You don't wait until you feel different before you continue the work. You continue the work while you feel however you feel. And you let the experience of having continued the work through the discomfort start to update what you believe about what you're capable of. The successful people who'll tell you privately how close it was to not happening will also tell you, if the conversation goes deep enough, what they think actually got them through, and it's not what most people would guess. They won't tell you it was their certainty that it was going to work. None of them had that. They won't tell you it was their unshakable belief in themselves. None of them had that either, at least not unbroken across the long middle. They'll tell you something different, something harder to name and harder to develop, something that turned out to be the only thing that actually mattered. What they'll tell you is that they kept going without certainty, not because they were unusually brave, not because they had access to some inner reservoir of confidence that protected them from the doubt. They kept going because they had decided at some point earlier that they were going to keep going regardless of how the doubt resolved on any given day. The decision had been made, and the decision didn't need to be made again every morning. They weren't waiting to feel better about the project before they continued working on it. They were continuing to work on it while they felt however they felt, including, frequently, feeling that it wasn't going to work. This is a meaningfully different operating mode than what most people use. Most people are in a constant negotiation with themselves about whether to continue. The negotiation runs in the background. Each time the doubt comes up, each time the project hits a stretch of difficulty, each time the evidence available is mixed or unfavorable, the negotiation reopens and has to be settled again. And that negotiation burns enormous energy and produces unstable results. Some days the negotiation goes one way and the work continues. Some days it goes the other way and the work falters. Across long timelines, the average is mediocre. Even when the days the negotiation went well were genuinely strong. The people who get through have at some point taken the negotiation off the table. The decision to continue has been settled at a level deeper than daily mood. They're not asking every morning whether today is the day they're going to keep going. They're just going. The doubt is allowed to be there. The discomfort is allowed to be there. The mixed evidence is allowed to be there. None of it has the power to reopen the question of whether to continue, because that question isn't currently open. This isn't the same as fanaticism. It isn't the same as ignoring the evidence, refusing to update, pushing forward, regardless of whether the direction is right. The people who do this well stay capable of reassessing the direction when the reassessment is genuinely warranted. They aren't committed to the specific direction beyond what the evidence supports. What they're committed to is the larger project of building something with their lives. And the specific direction can be updated in service of that larger commitment without the larger commitment itself being up for daily review. The direction is reviewable. The commitment to building is not. This distinction matters because the difference between the people who get through and the people who don't is rarely the quality of the original idea or the specific direction. The direction often changes. The original idea is often abandoned for a better one that emerged from the work. What doesn't change is whether the person stays in the larger project of building. Through the periods when the specific direction is unclear and the evidence is mixed and the doubt is loud, the person who stays through those periods is the person who eventually arrives somewhere worth arriving at. The person who doesn't stay is the person who leaves before the meeting, between preparation and conditions, has had a chance to happen. The willingness to keep going without certainty is, in the end, the only thing the people who succeed will name as the actual mechanism. Everything else is downstream of that. The skill, the relationships, the eventual opening. All of those things require a person to still be there when the long preparation finally produces the result. The person who has left isn't there. The person who's still there is the one who benefits. And being still there is, more than any other variable, what determines who's in position to benefit when the world finally does its part. So if there's one thing to take from all of this, it isn't a strategy. It isn't a technique. It isn't a formula. It's a recognition. The people who've done what you want to do didn't get through it on certainty. They got through it on a willingness to continue without certainty, which is harder and more boring and more sustainable than the dramatic alternatives most people imagine. They weren't different from you in the way you think. They were sitting inside the same uncertainty. They were managing the same doubt. They just kept going through it for longer, with less drama, less negotiation, until eventually the conditions resolved. The meeting happened, and the long preparation became the success that gets described in cleaned up form in the public version of the story. That's the whole thing. There's nothing else to it. The only work that has ever mattered is the work of staying when staying is what's required, and continuing the building when there's nobody to tell you whether the building is going to produce what you hope it will produce. Stay, continue. The rest will resolve itself in its own time, in ways you don't need to control and couldn't control if you tried.